After the Civil War, of course, we enter into a political cycle referred to as Reconstruction. And depending on who you talk to, you will get a variety of answers. For African Americans, Reconstruction is an important time. For the free black and self-educated people, they are now for the first time able to participate in the political process in the South in ways they had not been able to do so before, and in some cases even in the North. And let's not make the mistake of thinking the North was land of freedom and opportunity for black people, because it was not. The same forms of structural and institutional racisms existed there as well. The difference was there were enclaves of people protecting and supporting them.
For many African Americans, some 4 million people who are freed from slavery in the southern states, the experience of Reconstruction is simultaneously one of tremendous joy and promise and hope, and one of real hardship and uncertainty and sorrow. It's joyful, of course, because people are no longer enslaved. People have the right to control their own labor. Men and women finally have the legal right to marry. Men and women now have legal rights as parents. They can keep their children with them rather than risking losing them to sale. So there's a tremendous sense of optimism and hope. People participate in politics in unprecedented levels. Right, at the local level, people organize political associations to gain information about state and national politics. People participate in elections, and for the first time, black men in meaningful numbers are voted into office at local governments, at the level of state governments, and even at the level of the national government. It's the first time that we see black men in the halls of Congress, for example. So it's really this moment of tremendous change and promise.
There's a story of a man by the name of Garland White. Garland White was born in Virginia. He was born a slave in Virginia, and he, at the age of 9, was taken from his mother and was sold to a man who would eventually become a congressman. He gets to Washington, D.C., and by the age of 13, he actually runs away, makes his way to Canada. And he, in Canada, gets an education. He becomes a minister. He comes back into the United States and settles in Ohio. When the war breaks out, he immediately is one of those freemen who want to enlist and is denied the ability to enlist. He continues to work in Ohio to try to recruit and to work through this problem. Eventually, because of, again, the Emancipation Proclamation and the formation of USCTs, he joins and becomes a chaplain. He sees combat. He cares for the souls of the soldiers. But he has the most amazing thing happen to him. When the regiment comes into Richmond on April 2nd, after the Confederates have evacuated, the Union armies start marching in actually on April 3rd, Garland White is there with his regiment. And there is cheering and all kinds of things happening from the Unionists and the throngs of African Americans that have taken to the streets. During one of the celebrations, one of the soldiers comes up to him and says, "There's a woman that wants to meet you." And he goes over to the woman, and in that moment, he is meeting his mother, someone he has not seen since he was 9 years old. He is reunited with his mother in Richmond. And it is an extraordinary story that is shared by journalist Thomas Chester and ends up being picked up around the world. And Garland White, it's an amazing story for him to actually find her. And it's one that cannot be lost, because as soon as this war is over, that's exactly what people do. They take to the highways and byways on foot with nothing but the clothes on their back in many cases, or whatever provisions they can scrounge, and they set out looking for loved ones that were sold from them.
At the same time, virtually every African American community has to contend with the legacies of slavery. the loss of relatives that cannot be located after the war. And we see heartbreaking letters written to local governments, written to the military, published in newspapers, of people seeking information about children they've lost to sale, about spouses who have disappeared. And people don't know if their families are alive or dead, don't know where their families are. So there's that aspect of loss that remains very much a part of people's daily lives. There's also the reality of harsh retribution on the part of many Southern slaveholders, and even many white Southerners who were not slaveholders, who were deeply angered and perhaps even terrified by this advent of Black freedom in the United States.
The problem, the failure of Reconstruction, is that for white Southerners, this new reality was something they simply could not and would not tolerate. So once the federal government leaves, the occupiers leave, which is one of the terms that's often used, every attempt is made to return to a social status quo that keeps whites in positions as the superior.
And so we see night riders and vigilantes terrorizing Black men who seek to become involved in politics, terrorizing Black communities that are gaining their own property, right? Terrorizing Black landowners, Black business owners, breaking up Black schools and Black churches. And we see a very clear grassroots movement at first to recreate the conditions of slavery, to insist that Black people may not gather on their own, may not acquire education, may not become property owners, may not work for themselves and their own benefit. And so there are local mandates, local ordinances, local legislation that seek to recreate those conditions. And that will become a struggle that endures for much of the 19th century for African Americans who are determined to make good on their rights as citizens and free people in the United States. The period of Reconstruction lasts in the Southern states and in the nation as a whole through 1877. The Union military is stationed in the Southern states from the end of the Civil War through 1877. And at least until then, there's a sense that the federal government is backing its commitment to safeguarding African Americans' rights as free people, as citizens, the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to gain an education. But after 1877, that commitment seems to recede. The commitment on the part of the federal government to safeguarding Black people's rights, and certainly the commitment of state governments to recognizing African Americans as citizens and fully free people. And it recedes slowly but clearly through the late 19th century. Increasingly, there are laws that mandate segregation, that bar Black people from public accommodations, whether it's hotels and restaurants, whether it's public transportation, whether it's the public education system. There are laws that restrict employment and the hiring of African American men and women. So Black people are barred from certain kinds of occupations. African American students are barred from higher education. Right, and that's why through the late 19th century, we see a real commitment on the part of African American communities to create institutions of higher education, high schools, colleges, teacher training institutions, to make up for their exclusion from the mainstream institutions. And this continues through the end of the 19th century. And by the time we get to the late 19th century, we'll see Supreme Court cases that mandate that segregation is legal and the law of the land. So by the late 19th century, there's a sense that the promise of emancipation and the initial promises of Reconstruction have really faded at the level of American politics and the political landscape, though they haven't faded among Black communities, among African American leaders, African American workers, African American intellectuals and activists who remain committed to pursuing their rights and opportunities as American citizens.